This commenter brings up such an important point about the way that environmental history is taught in the United States that just leaves out the history of white supremacy and genocide. So let's get into it. When I was taught environmental history in the 1980s, it was very much top of mind at the time. It was very trendy at the time. It was definitely emphasized in my school. But what was taught was this idea that previous generations of white Americans were wasteful, that they didn't understand that nature was not a finite resource, that they just were extractive and took too much. And now that we're older and wiser as a country, we are going to do better about not extracting too much and taking more than we should from the environment. That was what was taught to me. I was also taught this reverence for natural spaces, that these spaces were preserved and pristine and beautiful and a way for people to appreciate the natural world, right? But there is a darker side to that history that was absolutely left out. So let's talk about it. So what I was taught in elementary school about the near extinction of the American buffalo was that the white settlers of the American West were wasteful, that they were extractive in their philosophy, and they just did not understand how truly valuable the buffalo were. They took them for granted, and so they went in and slaughtered too many and took more than they needed. And also this idea was that buffalo tongue was some sort of delicacy on the East Coast, and so people would go and just slaughter whole buffalo herds and leave them and just take the tongues and, preserve the tongues and send them back to the East Coast on trains. Like, this was the story that I was told. Very vivid, right? You can imagine this. But they're leaving out a pretty important piece of this, which is that the United States Army was at war with the Plains Indians. And they paid people to kill buffalo in order to starve out the enemy in this war. They were at war with the Native Americans of the Plains, and the buffalo was their staple food source. So they paid people to slaughter buffalo. And this was very, very effective. They almost drove the buffalo to extinction in a couple of decades after there were millions of buffalo on the American continent. So this was an act of war. Now, were the settlers of the American West more wasteful? Is this even a thing? I mean, I don't think so. I think that it's true that if you're coming into a new environment and you're taking these farming techniques that you had from Western Europe with you to this new environment, those techniques might not work, and maybe you have some traditions that don't translate to this new environment. And if you're wealthy and you're coming to settle some part of the American West, are you wasteful? Sure. Because if you have a surplus, then that's how you act. But if you're a poor farmer and you're coming into this new territory, are you going to be wasteful when you hunt a buffalo? No, of course not. Like, you're going to hunt this buffalo and you're going to preserve all the meat and you're going to tan all the skins and you're going to use every piece of that animal because you need it for food. So it was patronizing to say that somehow the white folks didn't know what they were doing. They absolutely knew what they were doing. They were starving out an enemy that they were at war with. This was a tool of genocide. That, along with, sending blankets that were infected with smallpox, this was a tool of genocide. Now, this dynamic of erasing Native American history from the history of the Western United States was also at play during the creation of the national park system. And I'm going to use the example of Yosemite National Park in California because I think it's a really great example. Now, this photo is one of a series of very famous photographs that were taken by Ansel Adams in the 1940s in Yosemite National Park. These are iconic photographs. These are on the wall of every environmental fan anyone who's ever hiked Half Dome has this picture on their wall, right? This is a picture of Mirror Lake. So Ansel Adams took these photographs in the 1940s, and they were of this pristine and empty landscape, free of human footprints. But the National Park System and the government of the United States had just finished removing all of the Miwok villages from Yosemite National Park, and they are the Native American tribe that has lived in the Yosemite Valley for centuries. The Miwok lived for centuries in Yosemite Valley in traditional homes like the one behind me. And what I love about this cabin is it looks so similar to the cabins that are built in Yosemite to this day. The white settlers who came into Yosemite Valley copied this building technique because they knew that it was sustainable. The Miwok would use the bark from mature cedar trees to make a sustainable wall for their home. They didn't have to cut the cedar tree down. They would peel off, on mature trees, the bark would start to peel off. They would take that bark that was loose and they would use it in the walls of their homes. The displacement of the Miwok started during the California Gold Rush in 1849. There was a gold rush in California, and white settlers started to pretty much invade the Sierra Nevada in search of gold. And in 1851, there was a first massacre and displacement of the Miwok in the Yosemite Valley, but they didn't disappear from the Yosemite Valley. They returned over and over again over the years. They would sort of melt into the Sierras and then return as soon as they could back to their ancestral homelands. So in the era when Yosemite was made into a national park at the turn of the 20th century, there were Miwok living in the Yosemite Valley. This was their ancestral home. And in the 1920s and 30s, they were removed forcibly from Yosemite Valley. Their homes were torn down and they were not allowed to return. Now, this is John Muir. He was a very famous naturalist and advocate for natural spaces, advocate for the park system, the expansion of the park system in the United States. And he was reacting, I think, understandably to industrialization, like a lot of people were. Industrialization created a lot of pollution, a lot of destruction of the natural world. It took people out of their rural lives where they were connected with nature, at one with nature. Now, they also had to struggle against nature pretty severely. Like, I don't think we should idealize that life, but there was something to be said for living a rural life and being connected to the natural world, being at tune with the natural world, understanding the natural world the way that a farmer might, or someone who is a hunter-gatherer might. And industrialization took people away from that, right? And John Muir grew up in Wisconsin. He grew up in a rural setting and had to go and work in a factory to make a living. And he eventually left all that behind and started writing and advocating for the natural world. What's wrong with that? Well, he was advocating for a world that had just recently been cleared, forcibly cleared, of Native Americans. So he was advocating for a return to nature for white people in an environment that was now pristine because it had been cleared of the people who lived there. They had been displaced. So when Ansel Adams was taking his famous photographs of the Yosemite Valley in the 1940s, he was taking pictures of a land that had just been cleared of Native Americans, and they had just recently been displaced. And that is a history that we, as modern people, really need to recognize and address and understand, that when we're talking about this idea of nature and a pristine and wonderful preservation of nature, what we're actually talking about historically is a preservation of nature for white folks after it has been cleared of the people who lived there for generations.